It was just finished icing the cake when the siren began, not abruptly, but with that long, climbing wail that seemed to rise out of the ground itself, slip through the open kitchen window, and settle somewhere inside her chest. Her hand tightened around the blue spatula. She did not need to wait for the sound to reach its full pitch to know what it was. The city of Des Moines had mailed the schedule weeks earlier, in late April of 1955, printed on thin paper with block lettering, the seal of the Municipal Civil Defense Office, and a clear designation: National Exercise, Operation Alert. Everyone knew the test was part of a coordinated mobilization directed from Washington, scheduled for the morning of May 4th, 1955, involving cities from coast to coast under the supervision of the Federal Civil Defense Administration. Recognition came almost instantly, before fear had time to decide whether it was warranted. Still, the frosting gleamed under the overhead bulb, smoothed with deliberate care, too perfect for a morning already unsettled by the date circled in red on the calendar. She stood listening as the siren, mounted atop the neighborhood post office, one of several towers installed with federal matching funds after 1951, traveled down a block, echoed off the single-story houses built with post-war financing, and merged with the barking of the same dog that reacted every time, incapable of distinguishing rehearsal from disaster. The radio cut off mid-song, as many stations were instructed to do during the exercise, and in its place came the voice of a male announcer, calm and official, instructing listeners to proceed to designated shelter areas, to avoid telephone use during the alert, to assist children and the elderly, and to await the all-clear, language closely tracking FCDA scripts circulated to local broadcasters. She wiped her hands on her faded cotton apron and called for Tommy, her voice firm with the authority repetition had given it. He was to put on his shoes. It was only a drill. The birthday party would go on. The invitations, already sent, still meant something. Susan began to cry in the next room, startled less by the sound than by the tension that had entered adult voices, and she lifted her briefly before handing her to Helen, who stood at the door without knocking, coat unbuttoned, her expression too serious for a morning meant to begin with cake. They joined the slow movement toward the assembly point, following the route printed in the civil defense pamphlets sent home from school. Simple maps with heavy arrows, nearly identical to those reproduced that week in the Des Moines Register-esque coverage of the drill. They walked as though participating in a ritual newly added to the obligations of citizenship. Adults carried purses, briefcases, folded newspapers, car keys, objects chosen instinctively rather than for any clear purpose. Men pointed out turns and landmarks everyone already knew, asserting usefulness where they could. Robert walked beside her in silence, jaw set, eyes forward, wearing the expression she had learned to recognize years earlier, when the Korean War still filled the headlines and casualty lists appeared between advertisements for household appliances. In the elementary school basement, built in 1947 and later designated a temporary community shelter under federal guidelines issued in 1952, cold concrete and disinfectant mixed with chalk dust. Children were told to sit on the floor while Miss Wallace checked names against a clipboard, following district lists prepared in accordance with Operation Alert procedures. Tommy twisted the paper hat made that morning. Construction paper, uneven stars, a strip of elastic until it snapped. He looked up, waiting to be corrected, but she only smiled and motioned him still. Nearby, Mr. Abrams spoke quietly about a coworker excavating a private backyard shelter, citing recent articles in Life and the Saturday Evening Post that laid out recommended concrete thicknesses, minimum depths, and steel door specifications. Helen wondered aloud whether such thoroughness was prudence or a failure of proportion, a question echoed that spring in letters to editors nationwide. When, after the 15 minutes allotted to the exercise, the siren finally ceased and the all-clear was announced, someone laughed too loudly, the sound ricocheting strangely in the windowless room. On the walk home, she passed the Keller's yard, where Mr. Keller dug steadily despite the unseasonable heat for early May, the soil arranged in careful piles that suggested measurements checked and rechecked against government tables. Farther along, the Morrisons argued in restrained voices about depth requirements mentioned in the paper, each citing a different column. The smell of turned earth hung in the air, carried down the street like a shared admission. Back in her kitchen, she opened the windows wide, as if ordinary air might restore an earlier rhythm, and began inflating balloons by hand while Susan crawled across the linoleum, clapping whenever one escaped her grip. When the first guests arrived, children with mothers who fulfilled their expected roles with varying styles of composure, she greeted them easily, took coats, remarked on the heat and on how fast Tommy seemed to be growing. From outside came the steady sound of hammering, each measured blow marking the afternoon. The children ran through the living room, toys scattering, a glass of punch tipping over. She wiped it up at once, repeating that it was nothing, that it was fine. When Tommy asked why Billy's father was digging so deep, she said it was for storage, then amended it to an old project resumed. One of those household plans never quite finished. Robert appeared in the doorway asking what needed doing, and she sent him to light the grill, though no one was hungry yet, assigning tasks because structure felt necessary. Amid the noise, Mrs. Kaplan mentioned her son practicing hiding under his desk at school, a procedure already folded into the school day in many districts since the previous autumn. Another woman observed that when she was young, the greatest danger had been summer storms. The conversation faltered, leaving a brief, noticeable quiet. When it was time to sing, she dimmed the lamps so the candles would stand out, aligning them carefully on the blue-iced cake. The flames trembled slightly, reflected in the children's eyes, in an unwanted image, too often described in illustrated reports, diagrams, and Sunday supplements, pressed briefly at the edge of her thoughts. Tommy blew out the candles with careful determination and was rewarded with applause. She cut the cake into even slices, handed them out methodically, watching the children eat as though their enjoyment confirmed something that needed confirming. Helen caught her eye, held it a moment too long, then asked for the recipe instead of saying what she seemed to be considering. Later, after the house had been restored to order, she sat on the edge of Tommy's bed, smoothing his hair, straightening the crushed paper hat. He told her it had been the best birthday he could remember, even with the loud noise that morning, and turned onto his side, clutching his new toy. She stayed until his breathing evened, aware that for one full day she had kept something ordinary intact. Turning off the hall light, she understood that the fear remained, distributed across yards, buried in interrupted conversations, printed on schedules delivered by mail. But alongside it was a quieter resolve, rarely spoken. As long as tables were set, cakes cut, voices joined in song, a form of endurance persisted. Lying beside Robert, listening to the night through the open window, she let that understanding settle, not as denial, but as intention, believing that this careful repetition of daily life was what would teach her children to remember not only the fear, but the insistence that life, even then, even there, was meant to be marked and shared. If this story stayed with you, please consider liking the video. It helps these quiet, often overlooked stories reach more people who value them. Subscribe to Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Times to remain connected to stories of everyday people who lived through moments that shaped history. Each life mattered. Each story deserves to be remembered. We'd also like to hear from you. Share in the comments where you're watching from. Our audience spans countries, generations, and experiences, all joined by a shared respect for history and the lives within it. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.